Can you claim to know why humanity exists if you have never questioned the stories you were taught to accept without doubt? Do you believe in creation because you have examined the evidence with your own reason, or because you were told it is forbidden to think otherwise? What if the most ancient scriptures, hidden from common sight for centuries, reveal a truth about human origins that contradicts everything you were conditioned to believe? And what if a 17th century philosopher had already warned us that our understanding of divinity and creation has been deliberately obscured by those who benefit from our ignorance? The Ethiopian Bible, one of the oldest and most complete collections of sacred texts in existence, contains books that were excluded from the versions you know. These are not minor differences of interpretation. They are entire narratives about the creation of humanity, the nature of the first human beings, and the intentions behind divine creation that challenge the foundations of conventional religious teaching. When these texts describe the creation of humanity, they do not speak in the vague metaphors you have been trained to accept. They speak with specificity about the physical characteristics of the first created beings. They describe Adam in terms that Western religious institutions have systematically erased from their approved scriptures. But before we examine what these ancient texts reveal, we must ask ourselves a more fundamental question. Why would certain truths about human origins be suppressed? Who benefits when you accept a particular narrative about creation without examining its historical manipulation? Baruch Spinoza, the 17th century philosopher who was excommunicated from his own community for daring to apply reason to sacred texts, understood something that most people still refuse to acknowledge. He recognized that religious institutions do not preserve truth. They preserve power. And they preserve power by controlling which questions you are allowed to ask about the texts they claim are divinely ordained. Spinoza argued that the Bible is not a supernatural revelation that fell from the heavens complete and untouchable. It is a collection of human documents written by human authors in specific historical contexts for specific political and social purposes. When you approach these texts with reason rather than blind faith, you discover that they contradict themselves, that they reflect the prejudices of their authors, and that they have been edited, translated, and interpreted by institutions that have their own interests to protect. What Spinoza discovered through philosophical analysis in the 1600s, the Ethiopian Bible demonstrates through textual evidence that predates the Western canon by centuries. The question is not whether you believe these texts are divinely inspired. The question is whether you are willing to examine what they actually say when they have not been filtered through the lens of institutions that need you to accept a particular version of creation. Are you prepared to confront the possibility that the story of human origins you were taught is not the only story and perhaps not even the most historically accurate one? Can you allow yourself to consider that the physical description of the first human beings might have been altered to serve ideologies that emerged long after these texts were written? This is not about replacing one form of blind faith with another. This is about applying reason to texts that claim authority over your understanding of existence itself. If you cannot question the story of your own origins, then you are not thinking. You are merely repeating. And repetition without examination is not knowledge, it is obedience. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church maintains a biblical canon that contains 81 books, compared to the 66 books in Protestant Bibles or the 73 books in Catholic versions. This is not a trivial difference. The additional books in the Ethiopian Bible include texts such as the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and Maccabean, which provide accounts of creation, human origins, and divine intentions that are absent from Western scriptures. These are not new discoveries. These texts have been preserved in the Ge'ez language, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia, for over 1,500 years. The question is not whether these texts exist. The question is why Western religious institutions decided they should not be included in the versions of the Bible that most people are taught to revere as complete and authoritative. The Book of Enoch, which is considered canonical by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church but apocryphal by most Western Christian denominations, contains detailed descriptions of the Watchers, the fallen angels who descended to earth and taught humanity forbidden knowledge. It describes the offspring of these angels and human women as the Nephilim, giants who corrupted the earth and led to divine judgment. But more significantly for our inquiry, the Book of Enoch provides context for the creation narrative that is entirely absent from Genesis as it appears in Western Bibles. It describes a cosmic order in which humanity was created with specific characteristics for specific purposes within a divine plan that the Watchers disrupted. The Book of Jubilees, another text preserved in the Ethiopian canon, retells the creation narrative with additional details that clarify aspects left ambiguous in Genesis. It specifies that Adam was created on the sixth day after 22 other works of creation had been completed. It describes the Garden of Eden with geographical precision, and it provides details about the physical nature of Adam that have been systematically omitted from Western versions of Scripture. According to Jubilees, Adam was created with skin that reflected the earth from which he was formed. The Hebrew word Adam itself means red earth or ground, and the text makes clear that the first human being bore the physical characteristics of the soil of his origin. Now ask yourself a simple question. What color is the earth in the region where these creation stories originated? The soil of Mesopotamia, of the Nile Valley, of the African continent where humanity first emerged according to both ancient scripture and modern genetics is not pale. It is dark, rich, and fertile. When ancient texts describe Adam as being formed from this earth, they are describing a human being whose physical appearance reflects that origin. The Ethiopian Bible preserves this understanding. Western Bibles, translated and retranslated by European scholars with their own cultural assumptions, have obscured it. But this is not merely about skin color. It is about the systematic alteration of human origins to serve political and social hierarchies that emerged thousands of years after these texts were written. When European colonial powers needed to justify the enslavement of African peoples, they could not allow sacred texts to describe the first human being, the one created directly by God in divine image, as having African characteristics. They needed Adam to be imagined as European. They needed the origin of humanity to be disassociated from Africa, even though both scripture and science point to Africa as the cradle of human existence. Spinoza understood this mechanism of distortion. He wrote in his theological political treatise that the purpose of most religious interpretation is not to discover truth, but to maintain the authority of those who control the interpretation. When religious leaders tell you that certain questions about Scripture are inappropriate or heretical, they are not protecting divine truth. They are protecting their own power to define what truth means. When they tell you that certain books of the Bible are apocryphal and should be disregarded, you must ask, who made that decision? When was it made? And what interests did that decision serve? The Council of Laodicea in the year 364, the Synod of Hippo in 393, and the Council of Carthage in 397 all made decisions about which books would be included in the biblical canon accepted by Western Christianity. These were not divine revelations. These were political meetings of religious authorities who voted on which texts supported their theological positions and which texts raised questions they preferred not to address. The Ethiopian Church, isolated from these Western councils by geography and politics, preserved texts that Western Christianity chose to exclude. This does not make the Ethiopian Bible more divinely inspired than Western versions. It makes it less edited by European theological and political concerns. Consider what this means for your understanding of creation. If the earliest and most complete versions of biblical texts describe the first human being with characteristics that have been systematically erased from the versions you were taught, then the story you believe about human origins has been altered, not by God, by human institutions with human interests. The question then becomes, what else has been altered? What other aspects of these ancient texts have been modified to serve ideologies that emerged long after the texts were written? The answer is, nearly everything. Spinoza demonstrated that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible traditionally attributed to Moses, could not have been written by Moses because they describe events that occurred after his death. He showed that different parts of these books were written by different authors at different times and later compiled by editors who sometimes left contradictions intact. He proved that the prophetic books were political documents written to serve the interests of particular kings and priests. And he argued that once you recognize the human authorship and political purposes of these texts, you can no longer treat them as inerrant divine revelations. You must treat them as historical documents that can be analyzed, questioned, and understood in their proper context. When you apply this Spinozan approach to the question of human origins, you discover that the creation narrative has been shaped by countless human hands, each with their own agenda. The Hebrew scribes who first recorded these stories were preserving oral traditions that predated them by centuries. The Babylonian exile influenced how these stories were understood and retold. The Hellenistic period introduced Greek philosophical concepts that altered Jewish theology. The early Christian church fathers reinterpreted these texts through the lens of Greek philosophy and Roman imperial politics. The Protestant Reformation created new translations based on theological disputes with Catholicism. And European colonialism required these texts to support racial hierarchies that would have been incomprehensible to their original authors. At no point in this process was there a pure, unaltered transmission of divine truth. At every stage, human beings made choices about how to translate ambiguous words, how to interpret unclear passages, and which texts to include or exclude from the canon. The Ethiopian Bible represents one branch of this process, preserved in relative isolation from Western theological developments. It is not necessarily more accurate than Western versions in every respect, but it is less influenced by the specific political and racial ideologies that shaped European Christianity from the medieval period through colonialism. What the Ethiopian texts preserve is a creation narrative in which the first human being is explicitly described as having the physical characteristics of the earth from which he was formed, and that earth is the dark, fertile soil of the African continent. This is not a radical reinterpretation. This is what the texts say when you read them in their oldest surviving forms, without the layers of European translation and interpretation that have accumulated over centuries. But even more fundamentally, the Ethiopian Bible preserves a theological understanding in which the physical characteristics of humanity are not accidents or punishments, but intentional aspects of divine creation. The idea that different human populations have different physical characteristics because of sin or divine curse is a later addition to Christian theology, developed primarily to justify slavery. It has no basis in the oldest versions of creation narratives. In the Ethiopian understanding, as in the Hebrew understanding that predates Christian interpretation, humanity was created diverse in appearance because God created the earth diverse in its forms and substances. The human being formed from African earth looks like African earth. This is not a statement about superiority or inferiority. It is a statement about the relationship between humanity and the physical world from which we emerge. Spinoza would have recognized immediately what this reveals about religious interpretation. When institutions tell you that certain physical characteristics are more or less aligned with divine intention, they are not interpreting Scripture. They are using Scripture to justify prejudices that exist independently of any text. The Bible does not teach racial hierarchy. Human beings who needed to believe in racial hierarchy imposed that belief onto the Bible through selective translation, interpretation, and emphasis. This is the pattern that Spinoza exposed in all religious interpretation. The texts themselves are ambiguous, contradictory, and open to multiple readings. Religious authorities resolve this ambiguity, not by discovering what the texts actually meant in their original context, but by deciding what meaning serves their current interests. When European Christians needed the Bible to justify slavery, they found passages that seemed to support slavery and ignored passages that contradicted it. When they needed the Bible to justify colonialism, they found passages about spreading faith to all nations and ignored passages about justice and oppression. And when they needed the Bible to justify their own racial superiority, they altered the very description of the first human being to make him look like them rather than like the people they were enslaving. The Ethiopian Bible stands as evidence that this alteration occurred. It preserves an older understanding that was overwritten by later European interpretation. This does not mean that the Ethiopian Church has preserved some pure, uncorrupted truth. The Ethiopian Church has its own history of political influence on textual interpretation, but it represents a different branch of textual transmission, one that was not shaped by the specific needs of European colonialism. And when we compare these different branches of transmission, we can begin to see where alterations occurred and what purposes those alterations served. This is the method Spinoza advocated. Do not accept any single version of Scripture as complete and inerrant. Compare different versions. Examine the historical contexts in which they were written and translated. Identify the political and social interests that influenced their interpretation. And above all, apply reason to determine what makes sense and what is clearly the product of human bias rather than divine revelation. When you apply this method to the creation narrative, the conclusion is inescapable. The physical description of the first human being has been altered in Western versions of the Bible to serve racial ideologies that emerged long after these texts were written. The Ethiopian Bible preserves an older description that is more consistent with both the geographical setting of these stories and the linguistic meaning of the name Adam itself. This is not a matter of faith. It is a matter of textual evidence and historical analysis. But the question remains, why does this matter? Why should you care whether Adam is described as having African characteristics or European characteristics? Is this not just another form of identity politics projected backward onto ancient texts? No. It matters because it reveals how thoroughly your understanding of human origins has been manipulated by institutions that claim to be preserving divine truth. It matters because it demonstrates that even the most fundamental stories you were taught about existence itself have been altered to serve political purposes. It matters because if you can be made to accept a false story about the creation of humanity, you can be made to accept false stories about anything. And it matters because until you recognize how deeply deception has penetrated even sacred texts, you cannot begin to think clearly about what is true and what is merely useful for those in power. Spinoza was excommunicated from the Jewish community of Amsterdam in 1656 for arguing that the Bible is a human document that should be analyzed with reason rather than accepted on faith. His crime was not atheism. His crime was thinking. He examined the texts carefully and concluded that they could not mean what religious authorities claimed they meant. He demonstrated that miracles described in Scripture could be explained through natural causes. He showed that prophecy was not supernatural prediction but human interpretation of events. And he argued that God, properly understood, is not a personal being who intervenes in history, but the totality of natural law itself. The religious authorities of his time recognized that these ideas threatened their power. If people could interpret Scripture for themselves using reason, they would not need priests to tell them what to believe. If the Bible was a human document rather than a divine revelation, it could be questioned and criticized like any other human document. If God was nature itself rather than a supernatural ruler, then religious institutions could not claim to speak with divine authority. Spinoza had to be silenced, not because he was wrong, but because he was right, and his rightness undermined the entire structure of religious authority. The same dynamic operates today. When you point out that the biblical creation narrative has been altered to serve racial ideologies, you are accused of politicizing Scripture. But Scripture was already politicized by those who altered it. You are merely exposing the politics that have been hidden beneath claims of divine authority. When you argue that the Ethiopian Bible preserves details about human origins that Western Bibles have erased, you are accused of promoting divisiveness. But the divisiveness was created by those who needed to see themselves as superior and therefore altered texts to support that need. You are merely revealing divisions that have been obscured by centuries of biased interpretation. This is always the response when someone applies reason to sacred claims. The problem is never the analysis. The problem is that the analysis threatens comfortable beliefs and institutional power. People do not want to confront the possibility that they have been deceived about fundamental things. It is easier to attack the messenger than to examine the evidence. It is easier to dismiss inconvenient facts as controversial than to acknowledge that your understanding of truth has been manipulated. But if you have followed this argument to this point, you cannot retreat into comfortable ignorance. You now know that the biblical creation narrative exists in multiple versions that describe human origins differently. You know that the Ethiopian Bible preserves descriptions that Western Bibles have altered or omitted. You know that these alterations serve identifiable political purposes that emerged in specific historical periods. And you know that religious authorities have always controlled which questions are acceptable and which truths are too dangerous to acknowledge. What you choose to do with this knowledge is your decision. You can reject it because it disturbs beliefs you find comforting. You can dismiss it as politically motivated, even though the politics that shaped your current beliefs are far more obvious than any politics that might motivate their examination. Or you can accept that you have been taught a false story about human origins and begin the difficult work of thinking through what else you have been taught that might not be true. Spinoza chose the third path, and it cost him everything. He was cut off from his community, his family, and his livelihood. He spent the rest of his life grinding lenses to support himself while writing philosophy that would not be fully appreciated for centuries. But he remained free in the only way that matters. He thought for himself. He did not allow religious authorities or popular opinion or personal comfort to determine what he would accept as true. He applied reason to every question, no matter how sacred others claimed it to be. And he left behind a method for thinking clearly about the very subjects that institutions most want to keep clouded in mystery and obedience. The Ethiopian Bible is not the final word on human origins any more than Western Bibles are. It is one more piece of evidence that must be examined alongside genetics, archaeology, anthropology, linguistics, and every other field that contributes to our understanding of how humanity emerged and developed. But it is crucial evidence because it demonstrates that the story you were taught is not the only story, and certainly not the most ancient or complete story. It proves that texts you were told represent complete and unchanging divine revelation have in fact been edited, altered, and manipulated throughout history. And it forces you to confront the question that Spinoza confronted 350 years ago. If you cannot trust religious institutions to preserve truth about something as fundamental as the creation of humanity, what can you trust them to preserve? The answer is nothing until you have examined it yourself with reason. This does not mean that religious texts have no value. It means that their value lies in what they reveal about human beings and human history, not in any claim to supernatural authority. When you read the Ethiopian Bible, you learn something about how ancient African Christians understood creation and preserved texts that other branches of Christianity discarded. When you read Western Bibles, you learn something about how European Christians shaped texts to serve their own theological and political needs. And when you compare these different versions, you learn that no single version contains the complete, unaltered truth. You learn that truth must be constructed through careful comparison, historical analysis, and the application of reason to all available evidence. This is harder than faith. Faith allows you to accept what you are told and stop thinking. Reason requires you to examine everything and never stop asking questions. Faith provides comfort and certainty. Reason provides doubt and responsibility. Faith tells you that someone else has already found the truth and your job is merely to believe it. Reason tells you that no one can find the truth for you and your job is to think for yourself, even when thinking leads to conclusions that disturb you. But only reason leads to freedom. Only the willingness to question everything, including the stories you were taught about your own origins, allows you to understand the world as it actually is, rather than as institutions need you to believe it is. Only the courage to think past comfortable lies allows you to grasp uncomfortable truths, and only the discipline to follow evidence wherever it leads, regardless of whether it confirms or contradicts your prior beliefs, allows you to achieve the intellectual independence that Spinoza understood as the highest human good. The Ethiopian Bible reveals that the story of human creation you were taught is incomplete and has been altered to serve purposes that have nothing to do with truth. Spinoza revealed that this pattern of alteration and manipulation extends to every aspect of religious teaching. Together, they demonstrate that your understanding of human origins, divine intention, and sacred truth has been shaped far more by political and social forces than by any genuine revelation. The question is whether you have the courage to acknowledge this and begin thinking for yourself, or whether you will retreat into the safety of accepted belief and the comfort of not having to question what you were taught. Understanding is not the same as believing. To understand something is to grasp its causes, its context, and its relationship to everything else you know. To believe something is merely to accept it without examination. You can believe the creation story you were taught because it is familiar, and questioning it is uncomfortable. Or you can understand that this story has been shaped by human hands for human purposes, and that other versions of the story, preserved in different traditions, reveal details that have been obscured or erased. Understanding requires work. It requires reading texts you have ignored. It requires learning history you were never taught. It requires thinking through ideas that disturb comfortable assumptions. But understanding also provides something belief can never provide: the certainty that comes from reason rather than authority, from evidence rather than tradition, from thinking for yourself rather than accepting what others have decided you should think. Spinoza warned us that religious institutions benefit from our ignorance and will always resist our attempts to think clearly about the texts they claim to protect. The Ethiopian Bible demonstrates that he was right. The story you were taught about human origins is not the story preserved in the oldest and most complete biblical texts. It is a story that has been edited, translated, and interpreted by people who needed you to believe that the first human being looked like them, rather than like the African soil from which he was formed. And once you recognize this single alteration, you must begin to wonder what else has been altered, what other truths have been obscured, and what other lies have been dressed up as divine revelation and handed down as sacred truth. The first step toward freedom is recognizing that you have been confined. The first step toward truth is recognizing that you have been deceived. And the first step toward thinking clearly is recognizing that most of what you believe not because you have examined it, but because you were told to believe it by people who benefit from your belief. The Ethiopian Bible offers you evidence that this deception extends even to the story of your own origins. What you do with that evidence determines whether you will remain obedient or become free, whether you will continue believing or begin understanding, whether you will accept the stories others have decided you should accept or think for yourself about what is actually true. If this examination of ancient texts and philosophical method has disturbed your certainty about human origins and divine creation, then it has succeeded. If you find yourself questioning stories you previously accepted without thought, then you have begun the process of thinking. And if you recognize that institutions you trusted to preserve truth have instead preserved their own power by controlling what you are allowed to know, then you have taken the first step toward intellectual freedom. Continue questioning. Examine the text yourself. Compare different versions. Study the history of how these documents were compiled, translated, and interpreted. And above all, think clearly about what you discover. Do not allow anyone, including me, to tell you what to conclude. Arrive at your own understanding through your own reason. That is what Spinoza would demand of you. That is what the evidence demands of anyone willing to examine it honestly. And that is the only path that leads from comfortable ignorance to uncomfortable but genuine knowledge. Share your thoughts in the comments. What questions does this analysis raise for you? What other aspects of religious teaching do you think should be examined with the same critical reason? And subscribe to continue this exploration of the ideas that institutions would prefer you never think about, the texts they hope you never read, and the questions they pray you never ask. Because freedom begins with thinking, and thinking begins with doubt, and doubt begins with the courage to question what everyone else accepts without examination.